In 1912, a 20-year-old Japanese university student stepped onto the starting line of an Olympic marathon in Stockholm, Sweden. He was expected to make history, and he did, just not in the way anyone imagined. Shizo Kanakuri started that marathon in 1912. He wouldn't officially finish it until 1967. Between those two moments, he would cross continents, compete in 2 more Olympics, raise a family, help transform Japanese distance running, and become known as one of the founding figures of Japan's marathon tradition. This is the remarkable story of the Olympian who took more than 54 years to finish a race. In 1912, Japan was entering the Olympic Games for the first time, and among its small delegation was a young runner from Kumamoto named Shizo Kanakuri. Kanakuri was already considered something special. Months earlier, he had won Japan's Olympic marathon qualifying race in a remarkable time of 2 hours, 32 minutes, and 45 seconds. He was just 20 years old. Now he was heading to Stockholm with enormous expectations. But getting there would be a challenge in itself. Kanakuri and fellow Japanese athlete Yahiko Mishima faced an extraordinary journey to Europe. They traveled by ship and train, including a long passage across the Trans-Siberian Railway. The entire trip took about 18 days.
Kanakuri even tried to maintain his training during the journey, running whenever the train stopped. By the time he reached Stockholm, he had traveled thousands of miles and had little time to recover. But on July 14, 1912, he stood at the starting line. 68 runners were about to begin one of the most difficult Olympic marathons ever held. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures were reported to have reached around 32 degrees Celsius under intense sunshine. This was long before modern sports science. There were no modern hydration stations, no sports drinks, no sophisticated cooling strategies. And athletes had very different ideas about how the body should be treated during a race. Kanakuri had trained under contemporary beliefs that discouraged drinking heavily during exercise. At first, he ran near the front, but as the kilometers passed, the heat began to overwhelm the field. One runner after another dropped out, and then came tragedy. Portuguese runner Francisco Lázaro collapsed during the marathon. He was taken for medical treatment, but his condition deteriorated. The following morning, he died. Lázaro became the first athlete to die during Olympic competition and remains the only athlete to die during an Olympic marathon. The race itself was becoming a battle for survival. Of the 68 runners who started, only 36 finished. And somewhere out on that course was Shizo Kanakuri. He was exhausted. The heat was draining his strength. And around the 30-kilometer mark, he could go no farther. According to later accounts, Kanakuri eventually reached a local home where a family noticed the exhausted Japanese runner. They gave him something to drink and food and allowed him to rest. For a young athlete who had spent hours running through extreme heat, the quiet house must have felt like an escape from the race itself. Kanakuri lay down, and he fell asleep.
He slept through the remainder of the marathon. By the time he woke, the race was over. The crowds were gone. The other runners had finished, and Kanakuri had not crossed the line. He returned to Japan without officially completing the race. In Sweden, the young Japanese Olympian became known as the runner who had simply disappeared. That might have been the end of the story. It wasn't. Kanakuri returned to running. At the 1920 Antwerp Olympics, he competed in the marathon and finished 16th. 4 years later, he competed again in Paris, although he did not finish. But by then, Kanakuri's greatest contribution was no longer going to be his own Olympic career. It was what he could build for everyone who came after him. Kanakuri devoted himself to developing Japanese distance running. He trained young athletes, he promoted competition, and he played a major role in establishing the Hakone Ekiden, the famous university relay between Tokyo and Hakone. The race would become one of Japan's most important sporting traditions, watched by millions and inspiring generations of young runners. The young man who had once arrived in Stockholm, hoping to make Japan proud, was now helping create an entire culture of distance running at home. His Olympic failure had not ended his journey. It had changed its direction. Kanakuri eventually became known as the father of Japanese marathon running. But half a world away, one unfinished race was still waiting for him. Decades passed. Kanakuri married. He raised 6 children. He became a grandfather. He continued his work in athletics while the world around him transformed. The First World War came and went.
Then the Second World War. Japan changed. The Olympic movement changed. And the young runner who had disappeared in Stockholm grew old. Then, in 1962, a Swedish journalist located Kanakuri in Japan. The mystery was finally solved. The missing Olympian was alive. And 5 years later, an extraordinary opportunity arose. Kanakuri was invited back to Sweden to finish what he had started. In 1967, the 75-year-old Kanakuri returned to Stockholm. It had been more than half a century since he had last seen the city. He visited the place where he had stopped during the 1912 marathon. He even met members of the family who had helped him that day. Then, on March 20th, 1967, Kanakuri returned to the Olympic course. There were no Olympic medals at stake, no competitive field waiting for him, no pressure to run a world-class time. There was only one thing left to do. And so, more than 5 decades after starting the race, Kanakuri crossed the finish line. His official elapsed time was 54 years, 8 months, 6 days, 5 hours, 32 minutes, and 20.3 seconds. It became the Guinness World Record for the longest time taken to complete a marathon. The number sounds almost impossible. 54 years. But Kanakuri had a wonderfully simple explanation for everything that happened in between. During those missing decades, he had gotten married, raised 6 children, and become a grandfather. He hadn't been running for 54 years. He had been living. And eventually, he came back to finish the race. It's tempting to remember Shizo Kanakuri as the man who took 54 years to complete a marathon.
But that record isn't his greatest legacy. His real achievement was what he did during those 54 years. He helped develop Japanese distance running. He encouraged young athletes. He helped establish the Hakone Ekiden. And he became an important figure in the development of the sport in Japan. The young man who failed to finish his Olympic marathon became one of the people who helped generations of Japanese runners chase their own finish lines. His story is therefore not really about running for 54 years. It's about what happened after he stopped. He could have allowed one humiliating Olympic race to define his life. Instead, he kept going. He built. He taught. He inspired. And eventually, he returned to Stockholm. At 75 years old, he crossed the finish line that had been waiting for him since 1912. Shizo Kanakuri died in 1983 at the age of 92, but the lesson of his extraordinary marathon remains. Sometimes a failure isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's the moment that sends your life in an entirely different direction. And sometimes the finish line is still there, waiting for you decades later. Shizo Kanakuri started his Olympic marathon in 1912. He finished it in 1967. But the greatest part of his journey happened in between.